Oh. Hi, I'm Kathy Daneman, and on behalf of Mystery Writers of America, welcome to the symposium for the 78th Annual Edgar Awards. Tonight's discussion is with the nominees for Best Novel. Our moderator tonight is Jaden Terrell, and our bookseller is Raven Bookstore in Lawrence, Kansas. You can learn more about the Edgar Awards by following us on social media using hashtag Edgars 2024 or by visiting the websites mysterywriters.org and edgarawards.com. The Edgar Awards will be live streamed on our YouTube channel on May 1st. During tonight's discussion, I will be posting links to our panelists' books in the chat. And please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box throughout the conversation, and we'll get to them at the end of the hour. Writing is Jaden Terrell. Beth Terrell is a Seamus Award finalist and the internationally published author of the Nashville-based Jared McKean Private Detective series. The other end of the spectrum, she's a proud mad catter with an upcoming cozy cat mystery written as Bethany Chandler. Terrell's short stories have appeared in multiple anthologies, and she is a contributor to international thriller writers Big Thrill magazine and Now Write Mysteries, a collection of exercises published by Tarcher Penguin for writers of crime fiction. She's the recipient of the Killer Nashville Builder Award and has received the Magnolia Award and the Silver Quill Award for service to the Southeast Mystery Writers of America. She's an active member and current president of the Middle Tennessee chapter of Sisters in Crime. Jaden?
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you very much. I'd like to start by recognizing my fellow judges, Kathleen Barber, Kent Braithwaite, Heather Graham, Renee James, and David Schlosser. I could not have asked for a better group. They were dedicated, they were insightful, they took it so seriously. They had a field of amazing, a huge field of amazing books. And so to end up at the top of that field is really an honor. So I want to start by follow that by introducing our panelists in alphabetical order. James Lee Burke is a New York Times bestselling author, two-time winner of the Edgar Award. I'm sorry, that was my parrot, and he's usually try keeping as well as the Grand Master Award, winner of the CWA Diamond Dagger and Gold Dagger and the Grand Prix de Literature Policier, and the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship for Creative Arts and Fiction. He lives in Missoula, Montana, and his book that he's nominated for is Flags on the Bayou. Jennifer Cody Epstein is the author of The Mad Women of Paris, Wonderland, The Gods of Heavenly Punishment, and The Painter from Shanghai. She is a finalist for the 2024 Edgar Award for Best Novel, was longlisted for the 2020 Simpson Joyce Carol Oates Literary Prize, and was the recipient of the 2014 Asia Pacific American Librarians Association Honor Award for Fiction. She has also written for LitHub, Book Riot, McSweeney's, Wall Street Journal, Self, and Mademoiselle, and taught at Columbia University and Doshisha University in Japan. She lives in Brooklyn, New York with her family and a highly demanding Springer Spaniel. She's nominated for the Mad Women of Paris. Jessica Knoll is the New York Times bestselling author of Bright Young Women, The Favorite Sister, and Luckiest Girl Alive, now a major motion picture from Netflix starring Mila Kunis. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. She has been a senior editor at Cosmopolitan and the articles editor at Self. She grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia and graduated from the Shipley School in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, and from Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband and their bulldog, Franklin, is nominated for Bright Young Women. Michael Kurita is the New York Times bestselling author whose work has been translated into more than 20 languages, been adapted into major motion pictures, and won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. A former private investigator and newspaper reporter, he lives in Indiana and Maine. He is nominated for An Honest Man. Colson Whitehead is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 11 works of fiction and nonfiction, and is a two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize for The Nickel Boys and The Underground Railroad, which also won the National Book Award. A recipient of the MacArthur and Guggenheim Fellowships. He lives in New York City and is nominated for Crook Manifesto. We also have two finalists who are not able to join us today. The first is S.A. Cosby, who writes Southern Noir crime fiction. He's written All the Sinners Bleed, Blacktop Wasteland, and Razorblade Tears, and he's nominated for All the Sinners Bleed. And our other panelist who could not make it is William Kent Kruger, the author of the critically acclaimed Cork O'Connor mystery series. His work has received a number of awards, and his standalones and his series as well, and he's nominated for The River We Remember. So my first question is...
Guys,
Yes.
I forgot to start the webinar.
Okay.
So I'm going to do that now. We're going to start over.
Okay. Is that why it says that we're in a practice session?
Yeah, that's fine. That's
Okay.
why. Okay.
How do you pronounce Mila Kunis? Is that it?
I think
That's it.
right.
Mila Kunis. Yeah, you got it.
Okay. That's embarrassing.
All right.
Starting now.
I'd like to start by recognizing
Great.
my fellow judges.
And I'll start with the introduction again.
Okay, sorry.
Hi, I'm Kathy Daneman, and apologies for the delay. We started, but we didn't quite start. I forgot to start the webinar. So, hi, I'm Kathy Daneman, and on behalf of Mystery Writers of America, welcome to the Symposium for the 78th Annual Edgar Awards. Tonight's discussion is with the nominees for Best Novel. Our moderator tonight is Jaden Terrell, and our bookseller is Raven Bookstore in Lawrence, Kansas. You can learn more about the Edgar Awards by following us on social media using hashtag Edgars2024 or by visiting the websites mysterywriters.org and edgarawards.com. The Edgar Awards will be live streamed on our YouTube channel on May 1st. During tonight's discussion, I will be posting links to our panelists' books in the chat. Please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box throughout the conversation, and we'll get to them at the end of the hour. Writing as Jaden Terrell, Beth Terrell is a Seamus Award finalist and the internationally published author of the Nashville-based Jared McKean Private Detective series. At the other end of the spectrum, she's a proud Mad Catter with an upcoming Cozy Cat mystery written as Bethany Chandler. Terrell's short stories have appeared in multiple anthologies, and she is a contributor to international thriller writers Big Thrill magazine and Now Write Mysteries, a collection of exercises published by Tarcher Penguin for writers of crime fiction. She's the recipient of the Killer Nashville Builder Award and has received the Magnolia Award and the Silver Quill Award for service to the Southeast Mystery Writers of America. She's an active member and current president of the Middle Tennessee chapter of Sisters in Crime. Jaden, take it away.
I'd like to start by recognizing my fellow judges, Kathleen Barber, Kent Braithwaite, Heather Graham, Renee James, and David Schlosser. You could not have asked for a better group of volunteers. They were dedicated, they were insightful, and they took it so seriously. They had a huge field and so many excellent books to choose from. So to be at the top of that field is a huge honor. I'm going to introduce the panelists now in alphabetical order. So they're starting with James Lee Burke. He's a New York Times best-selling author, two-time winner of the Edgar Award, as well as the Grand Master Award, winner of the CWA Diamond Dagger and Gold Dagger, and the Grand Prix de Littérature Policière, and the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship for Creative Arts and Fiction. He lives in Missoula, Montana, and is nominated for Flags on the Bayou. Jennifer Cody Epstein is the author of The Mad Women of Paris, Wonderland, The Gods of Heavenly Punishment, and The Painter from Shanghai. She's a finalist for the 2024 Edgar Award for Best Novel, was longlisted for the 2020 Simpson Joyce Carol Oates Literary Prize, and was the recipient of the 2014 Asia Pacific American Librarians Association Honor Award for Fiction. She's also written for LitHub, Book Riot, McSweeney's, The Wall Street Journal, Self, and Mademoiselle, and taught at Columbia University and Doshisha University in Japan. She lives in Brooklyn, New York with her family and a highly demanding Springer Spaniel. She's nominated for the Mad Women of Paris. Jessica Knoll is the New York Times bestselling author of Bright Young Women, The Favorite Sister, and Luckiest Girl Alive. now a major motion picture from Netflix starring Mila Kunis. She has been a senior editor at Cosmopolitan and the article's editor itself. She grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia and graduated from the Shipley School in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, and from Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband and their bulldog, Franklin. She's nominated for Bright Young Women. Michael Korita is a New York Times bestselling author whose work has been translated into more than 20 languages, been adapted into major motion pictures, and won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. A former private investigator and newspaper reporter, he lives in Indiana and Maine and is nominated for An Honest Man. Colson Whitehead is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 11 works of fiction and nonfiction, and is a 2-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize for The Nickel Boys and The Underground Railroad, which also won the National Book Award. A recipient of MacArthur and Guggenheim Fellowships, he lives in New York City and is nominated for Crook Manifesto. We also have 2 finalists who are not able to be on the panel with us tonight. The first one is S.A. Cosby, who is a Southern noir crime fiction writer who has written My Darkest Prayer, Blacktop Wasteland, and Razorblade Tears, and is nominated for All the Sinners Bleed. And William Kent Kruger, the author of the critically acclaimed Cork O'Connor mystery series. His series and his standalones have won multiple awards, and he is nominated for The River We Remember. So I have made some questions specific to each of you, and then some that kind of apply to all of you. So I'd like to start by asking you, Jim, what attracted you to that Civil War setting for this epic project?
Well, I've written several stories and books about the Civil War. And actually, the book, its origins, I hate to admit this, I took it from the Bible, and I've been doing it a long time. And I'm really afraid down the pike I'm going to have trouble. But Hannah, it's the story of Hannah. I got it right out of the Bible. It's a great story. And the other actual beginning of it was I borrowed from William Faulkner and his use of multiple personas. You remember As I Lay Dying. And I think that's his second best book. I believe that The Sound and the Fury is perhaps the best novel written by anyone, anywhere. It's just everything that you can learn about writing is in that book. And I was always an admirer. I don't know. You ask a simple question. No, that's it, though. Somebody once said there are only something like 23 plots in any kind of culture. And I've never felt that actually I wrote the story. And I know this might sound a little bizarre, but I don't remember my books, and they go away from me very fast, and I have kind of non-chemical blackouts, but they, I know, are waiting for me. I'll make it right. I knew Lester Hemingway. I was a good friend of his, and I'll never forget 2 stories about where do we go with our books, or where do we find them, the artist. And William Faulkner, just right before his death, said, had I not written the books, another hand would write them for me. And 2 nights before Ernest Hemingway took his life, he called Hadley, and he told her, he said, I reread The Old Man and the Sea, and it's like someone else wrote it. And Ernest Hemingway was not an humble man when it came to, I had great admiration for him. But that's it. That's it. You reach out and you kind of I think this is the only area in which maybe we can actually seek commonality with God. It's like dipping your hand in infinity, and you get to do it.
It is kind of
Yeah.
magical.
Yeah.
Jennifer, my question for you is very similar because I found the setting really fascinating and so detailed. How did you come to choose a 19th century women's asylum for your book? How did that begin?
I,
A 19th
I literally sort of
I'm
stumbled
sorry.
on it. Sorry.
No, man, I'm sorry. I thought, go ahead, please.
Okay. I actually sort of stumbled on it. I was casting around, as one does for my next book after Wonderland, and I went down a kind of internet wormhole on Victorian death photography. Has anybody ever gotten onto that particular trip? It's insane.
I'd say I have.
It's crazy. I found one, and then I was like, "Oh my God, that's actually a dead child." And then I just couldn't stop looking at these pictures, and I kept thinking there has to be some way to write about this. But I couldn't really come up with it. And then, in the midst of this kind of obsessive search, I stumbled upon an image of a young woman who was very clearly not dead. I mean, she was very much alive, very scantily clad, kind of contorting in a very somewhat erotic, but also very disturbing way. And it was clearly a very old photograph. And so when I looked into it, it was from the 1890s. And it was one of Jean-Martin Charcot's hysterics. And, that's how I sort of stumbled on the story of the Hysteria Ward at the Salpêtrière in Paris, and learned this whole corner of history. I mean, I certainly had heard about hysteria, obviously, and I'd even read about and heard about this particular asylum, which was the biggest women's asylum probably in Europe and possibly in the world at that point. What I hadn't known was that Charcot, who was really a medical giant, he's credited with all kinds of amazing discoveries, including ALS and a lot of other really sort of important things, went through a period where he was going to try to solve hysteria as a disease. And in order to do this, he used hypnosis as a clinical tool to try to sort of distill his hysterical patients' symptoms. And he then began doing this during his medical lectures at the amphitheater at the Salpêtrière. And these became, not surprisingly, wildly popular because he was hypnotizing young women in their underclothes in front of, into sort of very extravagant, oftentimes somewhat sensual and disturbing behavior. And this went on for many years. It was the last chapter of his life. He had a lot of other really important physicians working with him. Sigmund Freud studied under him for about 6 months, and it changed his entire trajectory. That's why he ended up actually studying hysteria, because of his time with Charcot. And Gilles de la Tourette, also the same thing. And I was just astonished and intrigued and fascinated. And I thought, this feels like a horror book to me. And I really want to, like a kind of feminist horror book. And I was curious about it. I thought it'd be really cool to try to inhabit this world and see if I can make some sort of sense out of hysteria and hysterical behavior and understand what that experience must have been like for these women. So that's where that started, and it was a long and very strange process.
It sounds fascinating, and
it was absolutely
one of those rabbit holes you go down. Jessica, Bright Young Women is clearly based on a very famous case. I mean, that's what sparked it. I'm going to follow your lead in the book and not name the perpetrator. We'll just call him the defendant. But it's from the 70s. What was it about that particular case and that period that made you say, I want to explore, or to use that to explore the themes you wanted to explore?
There was recently, within the last 4 or 5 years, a docuseries on Netflix that re-examined this famous serial killer and his crimes. And so it kind of came back into the zeitgeist. People were chatting about it on Twitter and social media. And there was a lot of old footage that was shown that was, just in
the light of 2019 or whenever it was, the docuseries came out, quite appalling with how the judge spoke to him, how impressed the judge was by him, and how the judge felt that even when he sentenced him to die for his crimes, that the tragedy of this case, and he's actually quoted, and you can find this clip on YouTube, as saying that he was a bright young man, and he could have become a great attorney and practiced in front of him, but he went another way. And it was a tragedy. And that was the tragedy, that he didn't get to fulfill his so-called potential, not the loss of these women's lives. So watching that, I was enraged, and I feel like rage and anger for me are generally good places to start telling a story, because it means I'm passionate about something. And I think with all of my novels, I feel a sense to, or a desire to want to correct the record, to tell, if I had accepted this narrative about this serial killer, that he was charismatic and brilliant, and that he was able to lure his victims to go off with him because of these positive qualities. But once I started researching the case, I found that this couldn't be further from the truth. And then I got even angrier, because I was like, how did we write about him, all these years later? And how did I believe that he was the special one, he was the bright one, when really it was the women he targeted? So that's how that all came about.
Passion is sometimes a great launching point for stories. You just dig deep, and it's obvious in the story that you wrote that you did dig very deeply. And Michael, you did too in An Honest Man. It seemed to me like the heart of that story was the relationship between Israel and Lyman. I know there were a lot of things. There was trafficking, there were a lot of things, but that relationship between them and how they influenced each other's arcs really spoke to me, and seemed to be at the heart of the core of the story. Did you start with that? Did you know that? How did you work toward that? I mean, where did you start? And how did you find that?
I started with a mess. I would love to pretend I had any great plan, but I had a setting off the coast of Maine. I love stories where we have this sort of friction between different people who lay different claims to a place, and the tension and drama and conflict of belonging and history. And I knew I had that in this coastal Maine community off this island. I'd also read about a real case where I discovered there was one cop. There's literally one cop policing this island off the coast of Maine, and a murder happened in his jurisdiction, and the islanders held a vote because they weren't really pleased with the way he was pursuing it, and they voted him off the island. And I thought, wow, okay, that's really something kind of extraordinary to work with. And I keep having to explain to people that that is the only element that I grabbed from reality, is kind of the most bizarre. But you put your finger on the thematic core of the book. The heart of the book is Lyman, who's this 12-year-old kid, has an abusive father. He's just trying to get by, but he has a really good heart. And then you have Israel, who is, by admission, a killer, and he's returning from prison and going back to this island. And so it was always a story to me of innocence lost, and when you can, how you can reclaim that, if you ever can, so the question of redemption. And I started with 3 words of fiction: an honest man. There is no such thing. So take that and run with it.
Did you kind of work your way toward that, or did those two characters emerge both at kind of the same time?
I love that question. You must be a writer. No, I did not work my way toward that at all. I was probably, I don't even want to admit how many drafts into the book I was before I really saw that, okay, if I let them run as parallels, if I let them behave as mirrors, that's where the story wants to be, and everything else is squeezed in the middle. But it was an ugly process to get there.
As it sometimes is. Colson, this is last but not least, and we'll go in a different order next time. But Crook Manifesto has a sort of I think of him as an anti-hero, Ray Carney, and it's the second of the series that began with Harlem Shuffle. It's a really, really rich environment, and Ray is a morally ambiguous kind of character. What was it about that setting and that time and that character that attracted you and that made you think, I want to explore this? And did you always know it was going to take 3 books to do it, and that that you had that much material with him, or did you come to see that during Harlem Shuffle?
No, yeah, it evolved over time. I started with the idea. Well, I was with my wife one day. We were in the car, and I was thinking, what movie should I rent tonight? I was like, Ocean's 11 again. How many times can I watch Ocean's 11? They must have had so much fun coming up with the capers and the different characters. Could I do that? And so I gave myself permission to write my own weird heist novel. And I was trying to think of who the protagonist would be. I started not the wheelman, not the safecracker, not the mastermind, but the fence. The guy who always comes in after the heist and is like, "I'll give you 10 cents on the dollar." That horrible figure who rips off the people who ripped off the other people. And I was reading about fences, and a lot of them will have a real storefront where they sell furniture or electronics, and they sell their stolen goods in the back. And to me, that suggested a divided nature. You have one face of the public, another face at midnight in the back of the house. And so I thought it'd be one story, but it kept dividing, getting bigger and bigger as I kept coming up with more capers. It was really sort of natural. It was going to be one heist, and it became 3 stories, and Harlem Shuffle, the first book, following him over 5 years in the early 60s in New York. And then halfway through that book, I had even more capers. And so it's like, okay, I guess it's 2 books, but what's a twofer? Like, a trilogy is a thing, but what's a twofer? I don't know. So it seemed I would follow him as he embraces and rejects his criminal side, this humble store owner over decades. And so I ended up following him in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and then New York became a character. When people are like, the city's almost a character in your book, I'm always like, oh, that's the most obvious thing to say. Like, Dublin in Ulysses is almost a character. Like, wow, that's really genius. But halfway through the book, I was like, New York's almost a character. And so it's following Ray Carney over 30 years, but also the city, the ups and downs, the fiscal crisis. So Quick Manifesto was the second book. It's the 1970s, and New York is broke. There's a fiscal crisis, and it's a new sort of setting for his crimes and the other criminals in the book. And so it ended up being this just simple idea. Why not a heist novel became this really big canvas of following a person and his kids. His kids get older, his wife changes jobs, and the city's changing, going through different iterations. So it evolved into this really, sort of lovely big canvas. And I'm really having fun with it.
I'm glad you mentioned that part about it being a character, the setting being a character, because every single one of you has a really vivid setting. And I have 2 setting questions. And the first one is, how did you decide? I can tell you all have done a ton of research on it, or you've been there, whatever it is, you know the details to make it come to life. How did you decide which details to put in or which ones to leave out to make your world vivid? Is there what are some of the guidelines you use to decide? Because I think that's something a lot of writers have a problem with. Let's start with Jennifer this time.
That is always a balancing act. I mean, I've written now 4 historical novels, and all of them are very research heavy. And that's always the needle you really have to work hardest to thread, in my experience, because I'm a former journalist, and so the research part is really fascinating to me. And you learn so many amazing details, and it's really easy to get seduced away from your own story and into myriad other stories that really have nothing to do with what you are actually trying to write about. And you can sort of end up not even realizing that. My husband and I joke now because I got sort of mildly obsessed with railway spine when I was writing this book. And I think I had Charcot talking for about 15 pages about railway spine. And I suddenly at one point was just like, all right, no, this is not, I'm giving the man the stage. Again, this is not what the book is supposed to be about. It's quite the opposite. I think in terms of, I think anytime that you sort of feel that you are making the details the story, that's when you need to cut them out. That's basically my formula at this point. The fewer you use, if they're very well chosen, they'll add real authenticity and intrigue. But if you start, giving them the spotlight, then you're going to lose your reader and lose momentum, and that's a challenge. I mean, I think of this book in particular because there was so much fascinating material about the history of psychotherapy, the history of hysteria, what these women ate, what the treatments were, what Paris was like. I mean, I could have just written 10 books, but, had to really just keep reducing.
Jim, do you have anything to add to that?
Did you say Jim?
Yes,
I'm
yes.
sorry. Me? Okay.
That's all right. There's a little bit of a lag, and so if I interrupt somebody, I don't mean to do that. But yes, Jim, do you have anything to add about how to decide which details to put in and which ones not? You're working on an epic scale.
Well, thank you. But I don't plan the books. I believe, again, that they're already written. And I always try to remember Milton's admonition. He said that he did not find light until he entered the darkness, in his blindness, of course. And I remember in one of his poems, he woke to blindness. Everyone else had light. And each, a more pragmatic answer, I aim for 750 words a day. And I feel a sense every morning that I have 2 scenes already put together. And they're there. They're always there. I've never quite understood them. And so I got a metaphor for myself. I look out my back window at big pine trees, and I always think that somewhere buried in the heart of that tree is a story. And we're going to take the pulp to the mill, and then the pulp is going to become paper. And somewhere along the line, ink is going to go up through my hand, and my eye is going to put those 750 words there. But anyway, it's a grand life. It is a grand life. And I think of it as something, a gift that I did not earn. And somewhere outside of us, each artist, no matter what kind of artist we're talking about, the gift is placed right there in his heart. And if he commits himself to that knowledge, to just take a moment of faith, and I'm not talking about religion, I'm talking about aesthetics, and somewhere down the line, all of those things will become manifest in its lives. And I've been doing that since I was in the 5th grade. Andre Dubus is one of the best short story writers who ever was born on this planet. He and I grew up together. And we used to be each other's pacing horses. Anyway, thank you.
Well, it sounds like a very intuitive process for you, and I think all of us kind of come to it from a little bit different point of view. Colson, any thoughts on that whole idea about setting and how to balance like all the stuff that you learned with what actually belongs in the book?
No, yeah, I mean, the research can get away with you, I think, because these books are split into 3 sections, and so one book has 3 different novellas in it, and each one's a different year. I have to confine the action to 1971, 1973, 1976, and so that helps to keep it contained. What's happening in New York City in 71 that is pertinent to the character as well. There's the Knapp Commission, the big police corruption investigation that's made famous by Serpico. How does that impact Carney and his friends? Well, there's a corrupt cop, and so Detective Munson's under the gun in 71. In 76, it's a bicentennial. What does the bicentennial mean to Black people versus white people? What does the Promise of America mean to someone like Ray Carney versus America at large. And so by having the focus on these different years, I'm forced to be a little more contained, and so it's very helpful. The structure itself was helpful.
Right, and it sounds like you also kind of tailored it to what was going to be most relevant to the plot and character at that time.
Yeah, I mean, they sort of talk to each other.
Yeah. Anybody else have anything to add about that? Anything you want to jump in with? Okay, then I have another question, and Michael, I'm just gonna open this up to whoever actually has an answer to share first. And that is that as you were all doing your research and stuff, did you learn anything that surprised you or that sent your story in an unexpected direction when you were doing your research?
I'll go ahead and get out of the way quickly here because I think of this group, I'm the only one who did not write in a period where you had research to both inspire and then battle. And Colson, listening to you talk just a moment ago, I was thinking of LA Confidential and the way he uses, the reality of the city to squeeze different characters and then drive the plot. But you can also feel like that's really helpful. It offers guardrails too.
No, it's a great model, yeah.
Steer. And Jennifer, you were talking about, the photos and how you can go down these rabbit holes and give voice to maybe the wrong character or offer the story through the wrong lens. And Jessica, obviously, you would have been battling that same thing, how much to put in there. Jim went the other way. He took a very small topic, the Civil War, and then it was inspired by the Bible. So he had these very nice, tight guardrails. I just made something up and then I put it on a fictional island. So as the coward of the group, I just want to sort of shut up and ask you about what you wanted to get in that you left behind.
Besides railway spine. Right.
Anybody an answer for Michael?
I feel a little bit like a coward because this was my first time writing in a non-contemporary setting and kind of weaving a story around a real historical event. And I thought, oh, yay, guardrails, scaffolding, this is going to be so easy. I've got all these almost like writing prompts, to make me think about my characters and my story because these real dramatic things happened. And it was probably the most disastrous writing experience I've had in all three of my books. I probably ended up throwing out over 1,000 pages that I would just keep turning in draft after draft to my editor. So I think just to kind of go back to the original question, how to decide what details to keep in and what to keep out, I didn't decide, my editor decided. She was like, this is, to your point, Jennifer, like slowing down the plot, slowing down the story, it's disrupting the rhythm. And there was one fascinating piece of the story actually about what in real life, one of the sorority sisters who was in the house the night it was attacked in 1978, which she actually went on to change the Florida Constitution based on her experience as a victim of that crime. And it's only been written about in one tiny little local Tallahassee magazine. And I tried to put it in the book. It didn't work, as my editor kindly pointed out, but she was like, I think this could be a reported piece one day. So I'm hoping to report on that with the sorority sister who did this incredible thing and who I find it absolutely amazing that I had never heard of this before I found this one tiny little profile of her in this tiny little magazine. And I just think it should be known on a national scale the way this serial killer is known and has had so many documentaries and books written about him, in the 4 decades since he committed these crimes.
Anybody else have something that they wanted to put in, but they had to remove because it didn't belong there or because it didn't fit with the rest of the story?
Actually, I had something that really I didn't expect to find that really changed the entire course of the book. And I think probably is partly what landed it into the mystery genre, somewhat to my surprise. But I hadn't realized when I started studying hysteria that at least in this particular period in late 19th century France and probably elsewhere, a lot of these women were struggling with trauma that stemmed from sexual assault. And that was a real common denominator for all of there were 3 or 4 sort of major hysterical figures that really took over Charcot's stage. And they all had this in common. And that was something I really ended up finding myself grappling with, because I was writing this book not only as the coronavirus sort of was shutting down the world, but as the Me Too movement was taking fire. And more and more stories about women getting, sort of exploited and manipulated and silenced by men were coming into the press. And this happens, I'm sure, with other people who write historical fiction, I would imagine, but the present just shines so strongly through the past sometimes when you're writing. And it was really hard not to find myself getting really angry. And again, that's a good thing. I think, as Jessica points out, you really connect to your material when you're angry about something. It gives you something to say. But I think that's also why my heroine, or somewhat, potential heroine, depending on, how you read her, ends up committing some pretty violent acts, because there's that rage is really the rage that I think I was giving her about the way that these women were being treated. And that kind of leads to, the mystery of, what actually happened in the book. So.
I'm supposed to ask if anyone has questions, so please put them in the chat. We have one, which I will get to before we end this. But they're here, and I have questions to ask, but I want to get to your questions as well. So be sure to put them in there. I'll go ahead and answer the one or ask the one that's in here right now. It is for Colson, and it says, to Mr. Whitehead, any thoughts about giving Pepper his own book? He could even get a war book. Have you thought about that?
Pepper, yeah. So Pepper was a supporting character in the first book, and as I was moving forward, he was really lovely, lively on the page. And I was thinking, can the structure accommodate someone, shifting away from the main character for a while? And then Pepper sort of insisted. And so he got his own caper in the second book. In the third book, he does get his own chance to shine again. So he's not getting his own spin-off, but he gets his own, sort of mini novella again. He's much older, not necessarily taking a beating as the way he used to. Maybe not, as quick on his feet as he is in the earlier books, but that's the march of time. So, he's a great character. He does get another story, another showcase, and we see him in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and how he changes over time.
Obviously, he is a character who resonates with the readers. Michael, I have a question for you. You have a background as a private detective. How did that help or influence your work on this book and the amount of research you need to do? Because I know you said you made it all up, but if you did, it certainly felt very realistic. The things like the investigations and how he found things, and the ways that he went about solving this mystery and so on. So how did your PI past?
Yeah, I think
help you?
It's very helpful in a way that journalism is helpful, not for plot necessarily, but for texture. It is very nice to be able to have some level of verisimilitude and understanding of, okay, I don't need to maybe break my back researching this. I can get into the scene with the character because I've been in this moment before. Particularly when I was writing PI novels, I don't have a PI in this one, but it could only help. And I think the greatest help of that work experience for me was you're talking to someone different every single day. You could be in the same day, you could go from interviewing a surgeon to a meth dealer, and they have very different languages and they have different approaches to questioning. And the way that they respond to the same level of pressure is very different because they don't feel the same level of pressure. And that's something I really wanted to explore with this book is every character. The one thing I thought of fairly early on was I want every character to lie, and I want the audience to know they're lying, but to have different emotional responses. So if Lyman lies, you're like, I get it, because he doesn't want, he doesn't want to go home to his dad. If another character lies, you might want to condemn them for that. And then I wanted to kind of push around the edges there, make it's more in the shades of gray that you get to the intriguing things. But the one thing you learn really quickly in PI work or anything related to Hollywood is that people are lying all the time. And that's just useful for a novelist.
Yes, yes, it is. I have got some more comments there, and I also asked some of the other judges what their questions were, so I have a few of those as well. We have, thanks for your Pepper answer, Colson. I love his assessment of the World's Fair. Pepper threatens to take the novel from Kearney because he's such a badass. For Jessica, how do you determine which story or book to push through with, and any advice on how you actually push through with writing a story or a book?
I mean, I wish I had advice that I could follow myself, because I'm constantly getting excited about one idea, following it down a road, and then inevitably hitting that part where I don't know where the story goes from here. Maybe I should abandon this and start with a fresh, sparkling, shiny new idea. I think with this one in particular, it's probably the longest I worked on a book. I think it took me 4 years to write. And I think I was just stubborn at that point. And I do abide by the motto that just because it's hard doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. That is something I tell people, a lot of days when I'm writing, it feels really, really hard. And I think sometimes I compare that to the experience of writing my first book, which was an anomaly. It was an absolute pleasure to write. I went into a fugue state to write it. And I keep thinking I'm going to return to that process anytime I sit down to work on something. And I've just now had enough time, 10 years now, to understand that was a one-off. Everything I work on from here on out is going to require a certain amount of torture, mental torture. And I think accepting that makes it somewhat easier on some days.
Do the rest of you struggle with that? And if so, how do you deal with it?
I mean, the one thing I always tell people when I teach is there is exactly one key on the keyboard that can save your book, and it says delete. So to Jessica's point, it is never fun. But if you can embrace that mindset, I think that's when you're going to get your best stuff. It's by saying this, and it's also recognizing that what you wrote was not bad. It just wasn't right.
Yeah.
Those are different things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Paul Engel from the Iowa Writers Workshop said something along the lines of the vast majority of writing is rewriting. And that's very much my experience, that, you just so much of it's just getting something on the page, not letting yourself look away from it, not letting yourself hide and just come back and attack it no matter how hard it is. But, it's always a step. And even the stuff that you delete, which I agree with Michael is absolutely essential, serves a really important purpose. I mean, if you don't, things that I've deleted in a weird way, I think add more to the final product of my books than the things that I actually write, if that makes sense. They sort of position it better. That adds a clarity to it. So I agree, it's an absolutely essential part of the process.
Colson, do you have a?
Yeah, I was just thinking morosely about my process, and I think I think the pages come harder now, but then I'm older and it's easier to revise them. I see what's wrong with them a lot more clearly, and so I end up writing at the same speed. Maybe I used to write my earlier drafts really fast, and I wasn't sure how to fix them, and now I think the earlier drafts are really kind of raw, but I know how to fix them in a much more efficient way. So it ends up being this, they end up canceling each other out. So
the scar tissue kind of pays off.
Yes.
I have a question here for Jim from Mary. It says, and I love this question. Jim, I love the way you know that time is not sequential. Your writing is soaked in history and spirituality. How do you think about time?
My father, he was one of the most intelligent men I ever knew. He never used a profane word in his whole life. That's an extraordinary person. But he said that to me once. I asked him about God, and I was 15 years old, and he said, "You don't need to worry about those things, Jim. Think of art and science as the discovery of what God has already created. And with that in mind, remember that perhaps that time is not sequential, and that today, tomorrow, and now are all one thing. And it is for that reason, once again, we must always remember that the human heart is the stage." And he said, "Keep your talent. Never give it up, son. Never give it up." And he said, "More people will correct you, and they will not be your friends." Because you've got a gift that no one else does.
That's very nice.
Very wise man. Very wise man. We have a question for Jennifer. Have you always wanted to write fiction, etc., or coming from journalism, is writing fiction something you had to work at? Do you have tips for writers who want to try making the shift from journalism or nonfiction to fiction?
Yeah. No, I always wanted to write fiction. I think from the moment I started reading it, I just felt at home in it. And I think like many writers or aspiring writers, I was very daunted when I got out of college. I hadn't known anybody who made a living as a novelist. I'd read, hundreds and hundreds of novels by that point, but had never met a writer, who a fiction writer. And I also just in terms of my so the opportunities that presented to me, I happened to be in Japan the year after I graduated. I spoke pretty decent Japanese, and it was a period where there was a lot of interest in Japan and news from Japan. So it was relatively easy to get a job there as a journalist. So I just sort of fell into that. But I like to, I think I always wanted to write fiction, even when I was writing nonfiction, and it wasn't very helpful to my nonfiction. I think I probably was an okay journalist. I am a much, much better novelist. And in terms of making the transition, you really just kind of have to take the leap. I did find getting an MFA super, super helpful. I know it's not an economic sort of an easy economic move for a lot of people, but I think that it's for me, it helped me find a community of people who are writing fiction, feel that it wasn't an insane thing to want to do, that I had this thing inside me that wanted to do it, and it was okay not to shut it down. And then, getting the encouragement. Those first few things that you start writing, it's such an act of vulnerability. And you really need to be around people that you feel safe around to continue doing it. And so I was very lucky to find people like that at my MFA program, and mentors who, reassured me that what I was doing wasn't a complete waste of time. And I came out of the program with a manuscript from my first book. So yeah, it's doable. It's really just an act of faith.
Those are such true words, always an act of faith. We have some other comments to share. Oline Cogdill says, loved bright young women, and especially loved how you never mentioned him by name. Very clever. And Melissa says, I've read Crook Manifesto and Bright Young Women, and I was fascinated by both stories. Adding the other books to my list. Thank you for being here, panelist. And Oline says, an honest man is so vivid. That was something I noticed too, the language. So you guys are all so good with language. You just like make pictures in our minds. I have a question from the judges. This one is something I've thought about myself. Sometimes if you had to choose between being widely read as a popular author today or widely regarded as a great author in 100 years, which would you choose and why? And of course, we all go both, please. But I think the premise of the question is we have to pick one. Anybody?
Well, I think I live on the Upper West Side, like 5 blocks from where Edgar Allan Poe lived at a certain point, and so like there's his little plaque, and obviously we're here tonight because of him, and he wrote stories that lasted, and obviously he was very troubled, had a lot of problems, and he wrote stories that continue to inspire 160 years later, 170 years later. And he, of course, had no idea what he was doing, that he was creating a form, that he was coming up with, getting his crazy thoughts on the page, and that generations later they'd still live. And so I think that's the sort of lovely thing, is that you can come up with a character or a situation, and you have no idea how it's going to resonate, and maybe it's not appreciated in your own time. But then someone 150 years later can pick it up and be moved and be startled and amazed and recognize themselves in this thing you did when you were on whatever crazy drugs he was on on 85th and West End Avenue. He broke through, and so that's for me that's really inspiring, is finding a way into something that lasts and also touches people in a totally different context, with a different way of seeing the world. You brought them into your space.
Oh, love that. Anybody else want to weigh in on that question? Anybody?
I mean, this is probably not the kind of dignified answer, but I would like to be widely read today. And there's a time where, I don't know, I might be self-deprecating about that. I guess I was a little bit when I said that, but I also don't think there's anything to feel shame about, to want to be successful at what you do, to want, I write because I want to connect with people. I want to feel like people want to read what I want to write. It feels good to me when they do. And I also believe that if someone is widely read today, the chances of them being remembered 100 years from now are also pretty good in your favor, probably.
Probably a lot higher in your favor. Jim, you had definitely. Jim, you had something to add?
Yes, thank you. Colson, that was wonderful. That was absolutely beautiful. That is a sonnet. You got it.
Well, thank you, kind sir.
Yes. Anybody else want to weigh in? Let's see if we got any more questions here. Yes, I have two more from the judges. This one is, all right, I'm going to start with you, Michael. What is the most obscure Easter egg or cultural reference in your book?
Okay, I've got a reference to another writer buried in an inmate's passing thought of a ghost. That one's kind of an obscure Easter egg. There are lots of references to my pets, because there's a scene where Lyman runs down the breakwater, which became, earlier we were talking about detail. When do you put it in? When do you not? And if I could paint with language the way Jim does, then I would say I just do what I want, but I can't. So I always think of, is there a story to the thing? Like, is it just a tree? Is it just a stop sign? Leave it out. If the character has an emotional response to something, then put it in, because it's more than a tree, then it's more than a stop sign. And for Lyman, the breakwater, the way he runs on that became something much, much more than just a bunch of rocks. And I felt like, man, I cannot stop describing rocks off the coast of Maine. There has to be something else there. And it was watching a very old cat run around and enjoy rocks, like truly enjoy. And you can tell when a cat is like playing war games in his head, I watched that and it kind of saved the book, I think. So I'll give credit to a dead cat now for the best part of my book.
I will say that is something that's going to live on in my mind about that book forever. I mean, it was
I'm
a
glad to hear
beautiful
that.
moment, and I could not figure out how to bring that moment in without spoilers, but you did it perfectly. Uh, Does anybody else have an Easter egg or a cultural reference that's kind of the most obscure in your book, or something that you particularly are interested in people knowing about, sharing? Now I'm going to make our little announcement here. I think they're all full of them. And so what you have to do is get these books and read them. And you'll find so much poetry and everything else. And I will say, Jim, when I was first turned on to you, it was from somebody I worked with who said, you got to read this guy. It's like reading poetry.
Oh,
Beautiful language. And all of you have just mastered it so much. And Colson, the satire and the humor and then the vividness in the Corta and the detail here and the emotional stuff in all of your books. Marvelous, marvelous work. Okay, so for everybody who is watching, please join us tomorrow night, Thursday, April 11th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time for a conversation with the nominees for Best Fact Crime. You can learn more about the Edgar Awards by following us on social media using the Edgar's 2024 hashtag or visiting the websites http://mysterywriters.org and edgarawards.com. Let's see if this is a new one. Yes, you can also join us tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Register for all future panels. It's just going to be in the chat. There's a place to register for all future panels and follow us on social media. And everybody says thank you. Great session. Thank you all. Great session. And thank all of you for being so fantastic.
Thank you.
thank you so much.
It was an honor to
Good
be
to see you
with-
guys.
I can honestly say I've read all the books and they are all worth buying. So I'm not even shilling. They are all really, really good. So congratulations.
It's an
Yes.
honor to be among all you, and thank you for inviting us.
Definitely. I'm excited to see you guys.
Likewise.
Absolutely.
Yeah, me
looking
too.
forward.
Me
It'll be a
too.
fun night.